Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another live stream. We are broadcasting at, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We are broadcasting 8 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, and wherever you are in the world anyway, whether it's actually Sweden, wherever you guys are, thank you very much for being here with us this evening. And we got a fantastic guest, and we got an amazing story, really, I want to talk to you about. So just before we bring our guest on, I just want to do my usual technical compliance thing here, just to make sure that the stream is going out okay, as it hopefully should be. So give me a second just till I make sure that it's functioning okay, so I can see some of your comments. And if you've got, by the way, if you've got questions and you would like our special guest to answer them, then just let me know, and I'll see what I can do. We've got a lot of story to go through. It has to be said. You know, people talk about, oh, the greatest story ever told. This is one heck of a story, and we're going to have to. Just reading your locations. Yeah, we got some, or we have got our from Hawaii. I say we got our Hawaiian viewer, our regular Donny Girl. Thanks for being here very much. Very much. You can send me your location. Yes, you made it live, and we are live wherever you are. You're all very welcome. Right then. Okay. So I want to bring on our special guest this evening. This is what we're going to talk about is the Titanic, and this story fascinated me all my life, and I suspect I'm not the only one. And we all think we know the story of the Titanic, but do we? Do we? And no better man to answer that fundamental question. And without further ado, I just bring on the author of the book. I've got it here, RMS Olympic, and that's John Hamer. John, welcome to the stream.
Hi, David. Thanks very much. It's great to be here.
Yeah,
And
John.
good evening to everyone, or morning, or afternoon, wherever you are.
Yeah, wherever they are. Yeah. They're all over. I give up on the time thing because you can't get it. You can't be correct. We're across all time zones.
Yeah.
So listen. So John Hamer. Yeah. John, look. Let's start off at the top, shall we? Everyone knows what happened to the Titanic because we've seen the movies. We saw A Night to Remember, I think, in 1950s, 56, 54, whatever it was. And then we saw Leon DiCaprio and the guys, the Titanic. So we all know, essentially, the story of the Titanic is this big, giant ship built in my local home port of Belfast, came on its maiden voyage across the Atlantic into an ice flow of ice, hit an iceberg, and sunk with a terrible loss of life. And the story, the moral of the story is man's hubris and nature. That's the story. That's the official story, isn't it, John? Might that not be entirely correct?
Yeah, you could say that. No, I mean, you're right. I mean, it is a very, very interesting story, but I'll tell you for now, the official story, which is, as you rightly pointed out, is based on a book and a film called The Night to Remember, which was published in the 1950s. The film starred Kenneth More and one or two other famous actors at the time. But the actual story that we all believe to be the truth is, funnily enough, it's based on that book and that film. Now, the story itself was written by a guy called Walter Lord, and Walter Lord was a very interesting character. He was an American. He was born in Baltimore in 1917, and he trained as a lawyer. And he then became a member of the OSS, which was a forerunner of the CIA. Okay, so the first question that occurred to me was, what on earth is a member of the intelligence services doing writing a book about an accident involving an ocean liner 40 years previously, because the book was published in 1952. So that was my starting point. And being the suspicious kind of guy that I am, I thought this bears some more investigation. So I started looking into it in depth. And to say that I was absolutely stunned by the information that I found over the following 3 years is a massive understatement. it's not the real story. Once you understand exactly the background to it all, is absolutely nothing like the one that we're told. Not in any way, other than the fact that an ocean liner sank with a huge loss of life.
Yeah, and I think, John, the thing that is that, I mean, your book beautifully details the whole story, and I think maybe the starting point isn't actually that night in April back in 1912. The story sort of kicks in, well, at least a number of years before that. So maybe because it is such a fascinating plot, it's a brilliant plot. Let's sort of start it wherever you want, and then we get to 1912 in due course.
Yeah, well, let's start at the very beginning. There was a gentleman, a high-flying financier around at that time, an American guy by the name of J.P. Morgan, whose company still exists to this day and still bears his name. But the original J.P. Morgan was a very, very wealthy man. In 1907, during the massive American financial crisis, he actually bailed out the US government. That's how rich he was. And from that point on, the government was beholden to him in many ways, and he used that to his advantage. He was quite a, shall we say, nefarious character, not to put too fine a point on it. But anyway, that's by the by. He became interested in shipping. He had lots of financial interests. He was one of the original people behind the plan to usurp currency from the American government in the form of creating the Federal Reserve Bank. But that's another side of the story. We'll talk about that soon. But he decided to buy a shipping line called the White Star Line, which was a British shipping line. And after a lot of negotiation with the British government, because in those days, foreign nationals were not allowed to own British shipping lines. So somehow he inveigled his way into that, and he bought the White Star shipping line. In fact, he had an umbrella company called IMM, which is International Mercantile Marine, of which White Star Line was just a part. There were several other shipping lines involved. The Red Star was one of them, and again, we'll see the connection there a little bit further down the line. So he decided, because he was a very clever chap, there's no question about that. He decided that instead of going down the route of speed for transatlantic crossings, he would try a different tack, and he would go for luxury. So he commissioned the design and building of 3 what were to be the largest ocean liners in the world. And work began in 1907, 1908. The first one was to be RMS Olympic. The second one would have been RMS Titanic, or was RMS Titanic. And the third one was to be RMS Gigantic, which was later renamed Britannic for whatever reasons. So he saw an opportunity, but it required a massive, massive investment. Even by his standards, it needed a huge influx of capital to actually make his plan succeed. And it was a very bold plan. But unfortunately for him, it depended on absolutely everything going right. Yeah. And as we shall see, everything didn't go right. So that's the crux of the beginning of it. It's J.P. Morgan, massive investment in a shipping line, building 3 gigantic, for the time. I mean, they're tiny now compared to the huge oil tankers and cruise ships, but at the time they were the largest. Well, they were the largest man-made moving object.
John, sorry, John, I'm getting a bit of feedback here. John, at that time in 1908, when it came to that transatlantic shipping traffic, I mean, that was the time of the coffin ships, wasn't it? That's when essentially the poor people from, well, the likes of Ireland and elsewhere, they were packed on these ships, which may or may not make it across the Atlantic. So that was the market that was there. And as you said, he saw the opportunity to upscale the whole thing.
That's right. I mean, there was a massive influx of people moving from all over Europe into America because they saw it as the land of opportunity and all the rest of it. And, America was accepting immigrants by the thousands every day. So it was a massive market, as you say. And He saw this opportunity. But of course, it wasn't just poor people that travelled on these ships, hence the luxurious aspect of it. He actually, I mean, he was a very bright man, and he thought, all of the shipping lines just saw ships as being a method of moving from point A to point B as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
But he actually was a visionary, and he saw he had the idea that people would actually do it for pleasure, which is kind of resulted in what the cruise line industry now, which is what people do. They go on holiday on cruise ships. Well, this was kind of a halfway house. It wasn't exactly a cruise ship, but he wanted to make that 5-day transatlantic crossing a pleasure, and and something that was to be looked forward to rather than endured.
Yeah. Yeah, so that was the plan, and then the ships were conceived, and then the building, John, started 1908, I think. Was that
I think it was
when?
1908, yeah.
So talk us through then what
Right.
happened.
Well, what happened was, obviously, Olympic was to be the first. So Olympic was built. It took about 3 years to get her built because she was the first one. The next one, the next two in the line, they didn't take as long because all the all the plans were already in place and everything. They had to modify the dockyard, for example, create something called the Thompson Graving Dock, which was the largest dry dock in the world, and it was the only dock big enough that to take the ships of that size. And so that in itself was a massive task to actually create this huge dry dock. So obviously Olympic, being the first off the production line, if you can call it a production line, it took much longer. So it took 3 years to get to the point where Olympic was launched, and she was launched in the beginning of 1911. She made a maiden voyage I think it was the 12th of June, 1911, which is just under a year before Titanic was launched. So she seemed to be a very jinxed ship right from the off. She had several minor accidents and a couple of not so minor accidents, all in the space of the first few months of life. In fact, on a maiden voyage, she actually collided with a tug in New York Harbor and destroyed it. There was a big court case, and it was a bit inconclusive, but nobody won, nobody lost. It was kind of a knock for knock kind of incident. But it didn't do much damage to the ship, to be fair, but it absolutely destroyed the tug. Nobody was killed or injured, fortunately. So that was number one. Then there was another one a little bit later where when she was leaving New York Harbor, she collided with a sunken ship, a sunken wreck, and it tore one of the propellers off. She had to travel the whole length of the Atlantic at half speed, and she suffered really bad vibrational damage as a result of that, because obviously it's unbalanced and all the rest of it. And she had to go back into dry dock and get repairs. But the real killer blow was, I think it was September 1911. I've got my date wrong there. I can't remember. I don't have my notes here, but she had a massive collision with a British warship called HMS Hawke, which is known in Titanic circles as the Hawke incident. Now, Hawke was like I said, it's a battleship, had a massive battering ram on the front, which obviously was used to attack enemy ships with. She hit Olympic amidships, caused a huge amount of damage. This was just off the south coast of England, around the Isle of Wight, for those who know the geography there. And obviously she couldn't continue. So she limped back to Southampton. She was patched up. The patch up took 2 weeks, and they were patching her up to get her back to Belfast to the dry dock. So as I said before, this was the only dry dock in the world that could take her. So they couldn't do a proper damage inspection until she actually got back to Belfast. She was out of commission for weeks and weeks and weeks. So not only was Morgan losing the revenues from her going back and forth across the Atlantic every week, but also the Royal Navy, who always have inquiries when there's ever an accident involving a British warship, found, unsurprisingly, that the crew of RMS Olympic were to blame, and so there was no insurance. And not only that, but Morgan had to fork out for the cost of the repairs to HMS Hawke too. So by this point, the project was failing. Morgan was slipping into this black hole, this money pit, if you like, and it was made even worse when they got her back to Belfast and they examined the damage. They actually realised that she was a wreck, and she was declared as such. Okay, she was actually declared a wreck, which is the maritime equivalent of an car insurance write-off.
Yeah.
So I believe that at this point in time, something very significant happened, and I don't know if you're ready for me to actually say that at this point, but
yeah.
and that is that I think Morgan and his co-conspirators took the very bold decision to actually switch the identities of the ships. They were
yeah, sorry, John. Just on that point, I think it's worth saying, and you put it in your book as well, that this was by no means an unusual thing in nautical in sort of.
It was a common scam. Yeah, it was a common scam. Where insurance was denied, which it obviously was, and they couldn't get Olympic insured again. Morgan was desperate to save the line, and because there'd been tens upon tens of thousands of people out of work, not just in Belfast at the shipyard, but the White Star Line would have gone under. Tens of thousands of people there, and all the ancillary industries as well as all the supply chain. There would have been financial chaos. So Morgan decided that at this point in time, I believe, that they would switch the identities of the ship, patch Olympic up just to make one last voyage, and then scuttle her in the deepest part of the North Atlantic, which is exactly where she is, the very, very deepest part of the North Atlantic. Not a coincidence.
No, yeah. And so his co-conspirators, who was in on this? Because this is a monumental conspiracy. Who were the main co-conspirators in your view?
Well, it was obviously the whole of the board of Howland and Wolff, and the similarly White Star Line. They were all in on it, but even more damningly, shall we say, I believe the British government was in on it as well. And I think we'll come on to that later because that's kind of nearer the end. So if you remind me about that near the end, but I will explain as to why the British government were colluding in something like that.
Okay, so the Olympic was essentially a financial write-off, and it was an economic catastrophe for JP Morgan, and so they contemplated then doing something which has been common practice. Folks, it's important to understand that it was common practice. I don't know if it still is, but it certainly was back in the day. And that's when then this whole process was to change the this is so confusing, John.
I know, yes, it is.
Yeah, so the Olympic had to become the Titanic, basically.
Yeah.
To be scuttled. Yeah. Okay.
And vice versa, obviously. So they spent the next few months surreptitiously changing the two to look identical because there were some subtle differences in the two ships. Not massively, and unless you actually knew what you were looking for, you wouldn't notice them. But they actually did a lot of work, some official and some unofficial, to actually make the two ships look as identical as possible to facilitate the switch. They were parked alongside each other for so long and so many times in the dockyard at Belfast that and the place, just so that people understand, it wasn't just a tiny dockyard, as you know yourself, David, because you live there. It was, especially in those days, it was a massive labyrinth of workshops, docks. The whole place was massive, and it employed something like 30,000 people. So nobody would notice unless they were in the know. Nobody noticed all this going on at all. So yeah, it was a lot easier than people might believe to actually make this switch. And it didn't take that much because the ships were already fairly identical anyway. But there were a lot of giveaways, and this is obviously how the stories got out, partly how the stories got out, because some of the photographs, I mean, in my book, RMS Olympic, I do an analysis of all the photographs, as you know yourself, because you've seen them, haven't you? Whereby, you know, I talk about show the different photographs and explain that that is not Titanic, that's Olympic, although they're telling us the opposite. And once you know what you're looking for, it is quite easy to see exactly what was going on. You know, so it's yeah, it's a fascinating tale of intrigue, shall we say?
Yeah, because the thing is that, as you say, I mean, there were. I mean, I've been up. They've built, John, up at the docks just beside where the ship, well, the ships were launched. They built this, you know, the Titanic Museum. I've been up at it and whatnot, and again, it's the myth is embedded and embedded and embedded. But there are pictures. There are pictures of the sister ships. So as you said, it wasn't. You know, people think, nah, it's impossible to have switched them. But truth is, it wasn't that difficult. It just required people keeping their mouths shut, didn't it?
Exactly. I mean, the only things they had to swap was actually the names on the ships. Now, originally the names were engraved into the steel sides of the ships. You know, the two bows, the port and the starboard bow, and the stern as well. It was engraved, but actually after the switch, they'd actually made metal plates and actually covered the original names up with metal plates. And it's quite easy in some pictures. I don't think I've got any in the book that show that, but it's quite easy to see that it was a metal plate. And yet we know they were engraved at first because it's documented. So again, it's not a big stretch to believe that that's exactly what happened. And the other things that they needed to change were the lifeboats, because they all had the names of the ship on, and the actual stationery, the writing stationery that was in the lounges. And that was it, because nothing else was marked, you know, individually. All the crockery, cutlery, bed linen, all that kind of stuff. It was all standard White Star issue. So they didn't need to do any of that. I think it took them a weekend to make the change. That's all, a weekend to make the actual final change and you know, unveil the new ships.
I have to say, John, I remember my late grandmother. She worked in a linen mill in Northern Ireland, and that linen mill they produced for White Star, and that was back at that time as well. You know, so I've had this another reason for me being so fascinated by the whole thing. But as you say, yeah. So it's not like if you were in the first class lounge on the Titanic, the tablecloths were just White Star. The you know, your teacups and stuff. They didn't say Titanic, did they?
No. But there are all sorts of other clues as well, actually, as to how we know that the identity was switched. Some of it is circumstantial. Other of it is more proof, shall we say. There's no absolute proof of any of this. If there was absolute proof of it, then the story would be out in the open, wouldn't it? Because you know, it just would. Yeah. So, but yeah, there are things like Titanic, which was obviously the original Olympic. I know it gets confusing at this point, but when they actually relaunched her as Titanic, all the floors were carpeted. And the obvious reason that they did this, because it was a massive expenditure to carpet a huge ship like that, was because they wanted to cover up the scuffed floors. They'd all been linoleum floors. They were scuffed. You know, they'd been well used. The Olympic had been across the Atlantic about 8 or 10 or more times by this point in time, and it was beginning to look used. In fact, some of the passengers on Titanic's maiden voyage actually commented on the fact that in places it didn't look like a new ship. And they also said that there was a massive list to port as well. Lots of passengers. Because one of the things that I've learned as a geopolitical researcher is that the best place to find the real truth, or as close to the real truth as possible, is in contemporary newspapers, because at that time they didn't cover anything up, because they didn't know that there was going to be a different agenda. So there are lots and lots of passenger statements saying that there was a massive list to port, and this was caused by the port collision. So Titanic, which used to be Olympic, was listing to port throughout its entire voyage, and people were concerned about strange noises, and it was just passed off as being, well, that's what it's like, it's teething troubles, it's a new ship, blah 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 blah. But yeah.
And John, there was the issue of the fire then, because that's come out in the meantime that when that ship left Belfast,
Yes,
there was a fire burning. Is that something you think probably was the case?
well, absolutely, definitely the case. There was a fire in coal bunker number 10, and they made no attempt whatsoever to put it out. None at all. They just let it burn. I mean, one of the greatest dangers at sea, obviously, is even in metal ships, is fire. And yet this fire was burning away merrily, and yet they made no attempt to put it out, which is very, very, very strange, of course. And I mean, this is not just me making this up. This is lots of eyewitness reports, quotations from crewmen, surviving crew people, that said in contemporary newspapers that there was a fire in coal bunker 10, which was never attempted to be put out at all.
So John, I've got a question. Whenever the Olympic was launched in 1911, and it was the biggest ship in the world, there was little publicity. When the Titanic was launched in the next year, it was unbelievable publicity. That's weird.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the strange anomalies that I found, really puzzling at first, David, until I realised what was going on with regard to another aspect of the story, which this kind of leads us into, and that is the fact that, as you say, the Olympics maiden voyage, hardly a mention in all the contemporary newspapers, and yet Titanic, which was the second off the line, there was a massive blaze of publicity. Now, I believe, and not just myself, but other researchers as well, believe that was to entice the great and good in huge numbers to the maiden voyage of Titanic. And the reason for that is, which kind of puts us onto the other thread in the story, if you like, was that Morgan personally invited, I believe, lots and lots of minor celebrities, famous people, the rich and famous, as part of the charade, because he had 4 major enemies. He was absolutely hell-bent on getting the US Federal Reserve Bank set up. Don't forget, this is like 1911, 1912. But he had some massive opposition, and the opposition were winning. He had the 4 enemies were Charles Lindbergh Sr. He was the father of the famous aviator, the guy who was the first to fly solo across the Atlantic. A guy called John Jacob Astor, who was regarded as being the richest man in the world at the time. Another rich guy called Benjamin Guggenheim, and another one called Isidor Straus. Now, they were not in favor of the Federal Reserve. In fact, they fought like tigers against it. And the reason that they did was not because of any kind of altruism towards the people. It was that they knew how the central bank system works, and the way that the central bank system works, for anyone who's not out there who's not aware of it, it comes with inbuilt interest. Up until the point where the Federal Reserve was formed, the US national debt was 0.
Right.
Okay, but the whole point of the Federal Reserve was to make money for the private investors who were behind it. And the way that they make money, and it's exactly the same with all central banks. The Bank of England's the same. Any central bank like to name, it lends money to the government at interest. So the only way to repay that interest is by borrowing more money, and this is how national debts accrue. Currently, the US national debt is about $30 trillion. which is a vast sum of money, you know. But anyway, I'm kind of digressing a little bit. But the point being that these 4 people knew very, very well that it would impact their own fortunes through a hidden tax known as inflation. So they fought like tooth and nail against this Federal Reserve System. So I believe that Morgan hit upon the plan to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Get rid of this wrecked Olympic masquerading as Titanic, and to dispose, as an excuse to dispose of the three of those 4 that were on board. Charles Lindbergh was not on board, but the other 3 were, and they all died in very mysterious circumstances. In fact, strangely enough, well, maybe not strangely enough, but something like 97% of first-class men on board survived. So very, very few died. From the first class, it was mainly second and third and crew that died. And yet these 3, coincidentally, all died. Now, Guggenheim and Strauss's bodies were never found. Astor's body was found 4 days later by a rescue ship called the Mackie Bennett, and which had come from Nova Scotia in Canada, which was kind of the nearest land to where the ship sank. And when he was found, he was only identifiable by the contents of his pockets. His face was unrecognizable. It had been battered in, completely battered. You know, it was a mess. He also had, as a by the by, he also had $10,000 in cash in his pocket, which was a vast sum of money in those days. I mean, you can multiply that by about 100 or so. So, you know, it was.
And of course, John, whilst these guys, these sort of the billionaire elite of that time, well, were disposed of. J.P. Morgan himself, he didn't manage to go on the maiden voyage, nor did his wife, if I recall. That's a bit strange, isn't it, John?
Well, it is. I mean, his wife was never intended to go on there, but he was, and he actually sent a telegram an hour or so before it was due to sail at 12 o'clock on the morning of April the 10th. He sent a telegram saying that he couldn't make it because he was ill, and yet the following day he was seen with his mistress in a French holiday resort, vacation resort. So yeah, it was all very strange. And also, in addition to that, 50 of his friends and colleagues, business colleagues, also cancelled at the last minute. And I believe that the reason that was done in that way was to make sure that nobody was suspicious or suspected that anything was going on, anything untoward was going on. So they all were told what was going to happen, and they all left it to the last minute deliberately.
And am I right in thinking, John, had he gold or was there cargo of his that was then taken off?
Yeah, that's right. He had some precious artifacts. He'd been on a tour of North Africa and the Middle East, collecting ancient artifacts. He was an avid collector of them, and he had these. They were absolutely priceless, apparently, and he had his priceless treasures removed as well. So yeah, and there's also rumours, and there's no corroboration for this, but there are rumours abounding that you know, there was $1 billion worth of gold on board as well. Now the rumours about that refer to the fact that this may sound really strange to some people, but trust me, I've been a geopolitical researcher full time for almost 25 years, and I know this to be a fact, and that is that World War I had been planned since the 1890s. They were just waiting for the formation of the Federal Reserve in order to, so they had enough money to actually fund the war. So I think what was happening was the British government were actually moving $1 billion worth of gold to America out of harm's way. Now, again, this leads on to another little element of the story, and that is that Titanic was being tracked throughout her voyage by not one, but more than one. We don't know whether it's 2, 3, or 4 British military warships. So they knew exactly where she was at all times. And they also did nothing at all to attempt to save any of the passengers. There are lots and lots of passenger reports of seeing these strange, what they call the mystery ships, around at the time of the sinking. People were falling in the water. There was no rescue attempt made at all. And this kind of backs up or corroborates the idea that the British government were in on the plot. And I'm absolutely certain that they were. There's no question about that. Yeah.
So then, John, so the Olympic, rebadged as the Titanic, sort of departs from the UK to cross the Atlantic to go to New York. But am I right in thinking there was another vessel departed 6 days beforehand, which I think is another incredible part of the story? Just talk the folks through that, John, because this is fascinating.
This is a bit of a mind blower, this one. Right. Yeah, there was okay. Let me set the scene a little bit. First of all, it was a miracle that any ships left the UK at that time, because there'd been an ongoing coal strike for 6 weeks. Right. There was no coal to be had for love nor money. There were ships littered around every dockyard in the UK. No one was going anywhere. People were desperate. They were clamoring for passages across the Atlantic or to anywhere else. No shipping line could get hold of any coal. Yet Titanic managed to. And bearing in mind that how many tons of coal do you think it took to get Titanic or Olympic across the ocean to America? 6,000 tons. Right. So it took 6,000 tons of coal. And there was another ship, and this ship was from, which I mentioned earlier, the Red Star Line, also owned by JP Morgan. That left London. Again, it managed to find coal 5 days before Titanic, so on the 5th of April, 1912. And incredibly, despite the fact that there was, people desperate passengers across the Atlantic, this ship had no passengers and only and a very strange cargo. Now that strange cargo, well, usually at this point when I'm doing this presentation live, I ask people for ideas what the cargo might have been. Get all sorts of weird and wonderful ideas, but obviously I can't do that here. But the cargo was 3,000 woolen sweaters and 3,000 woolen blankets, and that was its only cargo. Now it set off from London 5 days before Titanic. It was a much smaller ship. Its top speed was only half that of Titanic. So 10 days later, on the 14th of April, the 14th of April, it was sat in an ice field off the coast of Nova Scotia, waiting with its engine stopped. And when asked at the inquiry why it was sat with its engine stopped, but yet its boilers fired, the captain actually said that it was because it was too dangerous to move forward because it was in an ice field, but yet the night was clear. And 3 experienced sea captains at the American inquiry gave evidence that said, no, that is not maritime protocol. In an ice field, you carry on. You just carry on at whatever speed you want to cruise at, because icebergs, even at night, are really, really visible. You can see them from miles and miles away. Any iceberg that is likely to do damage to a large ship is very, very visible indeed. So that excuse didn't hold water. So it's my view, and it makes logical sense to me, that Californian set off with 3,000 woolen sweaters, 3,000 woolen blankets, totally empty, so that it could pick up the survivors from Titanic.
Yeah, because the Titanic, John, had about what was the total number of people? Was it about 3,000 passive collectively?
No, it was just over 2,000, 2,200, I think, but it was only half full. It was
which
only
is
half
weird.
full.
Yeah,
people don't realise that, but Titanic was only half full. And yet there still weren't enough lifeboats, and obviously they knew this, but I don't think that was part of the plot. The fact that there was no lifeboat, I think it was just financial. But anyway, that's a kind of a digression. So you now have this scenario where the Californian, which was the name of the ship, was sat in the ice field, waiting for Titanic, with its boilers fired, but its engines off, or engines disengaged. And strangely enough, that night, Captain Lord of the Californian went to bed, but he actually went to bed on a sofa in the bridge. And he was a tall man. He was well over 6 foot, and this was a 5 foot sofa. So it must have been very uncomfortable, and I can't imagine why he would have done that. And actually, so did Captain Smith of the Titanic. He did something very similar. So yeah, it's all a coincidence, of course, But,
Yeah. I can only imagine how uncomfortable it must be for a man over 6 foot on a 5
yeah,
foot something settee.
yeah, that's right.
But as you say, yeah, just total coincidence. So the Californian was sort of sitting there, almost like it was waiting, and
Yeah.
the Olympic rebadged Titanic was then firing across, and that night they were very close to each other, weren't they?
Yeah,
I know nautically
yeah,
they
they
were.
were. I think they
Yeah,
were about 19 miles apart
yeah.
in the end when Titanic actually went down. But strangely enough, Californian's wireless was switched off at midnight, or before midnight, in fact, because the incident actually happened at 11:40 p.m. local time. And of course, as soon as Titanic started sending the distress signals. By the way, for those who are not aware, this is quite an interesting little fact. Titanic was the first incident to use the SOS emergency signal. Before that, it had been something called CQD, come quick distress. But yeah, that was the first time that the SOS signal had been used in anger, kind of thing. So yeah, so immediately they realized they were in trouble. The wireless operators start sending out the SOS message, and there was no ship near enough apart from California, who had its wireless switched off for some very strange reason. And I'm not being facetious there. I really don't know why, unless there was some kind of a miscommunication, either an accidental one or a deliberate one. We're not sure. But we do know that there were other ships nearby who just never responded. In fact, there's an eyewitness from a Canadian gentleman, an eyewitness statement that was read out at the American inquiry. It was a medical doctor, and he said they passed so close to the sinking Titanic, he could actually see everybody in the water, flailing about on the deck as it was upending. And yet he said the ship never stopped, and all the passengers were incensed. They were up in arms about it, and they went to the crew and they said, "Why haven't we stopped? This ship's sinking," and they just carried on. They didn't stop for whatever reason. It's all very strange. But as I said before, we know there are lots of military ships around as well.
Yeah, and then here's a question: did the Titanic hit an iceberg?
That's the $64,000 question, isn't it? I don't think it did at all. I know there are eyewitness accounts that say there was ice all over the decks. There were third-class young men playing football with big chunks of ice. The first-class passengers were making jokes about, go out on the deck and get me a piece of ice to put in my whiskey and all kinds of banter like that. But now here's an interesting little anecdote about that, which makes me believe that there absolutely was no collision with an iceberg. I believe that it passed close to an iceberg in order to give the impression that it had, but nobody felt a shock or a jolt at all. But yeah, here's the thing: the White Star Line, standing orders for any ship in the White Star Line was that the 2 forward lifeboats at both sides, port and starboard, the very 2 forward ones, had to be hung out over the edge of the deck, okay, at all times during a voyage, while the others were all tucked in. The reason for that being that if there was a case of someone falling overboard, it was a much quicker operation to get the lifeboat down into the sea to rescue them. So that was White Star Line policy. Now, if it had hit an iceberg on the starboard side, as I said, then that lifeboat would have been at the very worst dislodged, and at the best dislodged, and at the very worst totally destroyed. Now we know that lifeboat number 1 was used in the rescue, so it was perfectly unharmed. There is absolutely no way that ship hit an iceberg. It passed very close. Again, lots of contemporary passenger eyewitness reports of seeing it glide by the window, but nobody felt any shock or any damage or anything. And of course, the reported damage from the engine room and below decks was that the shape of the damage allegedly created by this iceberg was very strange indeed. It was only 4 inches wide. Yeah, 4 inches, and yet it was 200 foot long, and it penetrated 5 feet into the ship. So that would have to be a very, very strange shape of an outcrop of ice on an iceberg to create damage like that. It just doesn't make any sense. For a start, I know ice is very strong, but a piece that shape, only 4 inches wide, would definitely have broken off in contact with steel.
So what do you think, John? Then what did create the damage to the ship?
Right. Okay. My view. I don't know the definitive answer, David, but there are 2 possibilities in my view. One is that she was scuttled. Okay. And what I mean by that is they opened all the sluices and sank her. Or 2, she was sunk by something like a military icebreaker or that kind of a thing who could create such a puncture wound in her. But again, the interesting thing about that damage is that nobody's ever seen it. You know, it's covered in many feet, tens of feet of silt on the bottom of the Atlantic. So even the expeditions that have been down there have not managed to spot the gash in the side of the ship. So, you know, we have to take the word of the people who told us this story, that was the shape of the damage. So your guess is as good as mine, but I think those 2 possibilities seem the most likely to me. But I guess we'll never know. Sure.
Yeah, because the iceberg myth is so firmly established that I think, you know, people do need to open their minds because, as you said, there's so many questions about that. But then, you know, regardless of which, John, here's the thing. So the ship, be it scuttled or in some other way crippled. So the ship, I mean, a ship did go down and it did sink. We know that much. We know. We know that it was a very clear night and the water was, I think, John, it was really cold, wasn't it? It was
-2 centigrade, the water. Yeah. And the reason it can get to -2 without icing is because it's salt water, and salt water has a lower freezing temperature than fresh water. And people, I mean, it's a popular myth that people think everyone drowned. No, they didn't. Some obviously must have, you know, but most of them died from something called hydrocution, which is the effect on the body of jumping into a very, very cold sea or body of water. And it actually stops the heart because it's just such a shock to the system. It's called hydrocution, like electrocution with electricity, hydrocution with water. That's how most people died. And there are all sorts of myths about survivors and things like that. So they were in the water for 3 hours, and it's just absolute nonsense. It's impossible. The average life expectancy in water of -2 degrees centigrade is 4 minutes.
Yeah, because didn't one of the officers who survived, John, talk about he'd been swimming around for for 30 minutes or something?
That's right, Lightoller, yeah.
Lightoller, yeah.
Yeah.
That's impossible.
He was a senior most surviving officer, and I believe he was in on the plot, as were most of the senior officers of Titanic. He was instrumental in the cover up at the inquiry, but that's digressing. Yeah, he said that he was immersed in water for goodness knows how long, and then he managed to get onto an upturned lifeboat with a few others, and they spent all night just balancing in freezing cold, wet clothes, which would have killed them in absolutely no time whatsoever. But it's, you know, until the Carpathia, which was the rescue ship, came along and picked them up about 4.5 hours later.
Yeah, because that's it. Because it was the Carpathia that came to the rescue, not the Californian. So
the Californian didn't even know it had happened until they'd all been rescued. Yeah.
But then, John, there's a really interesting twist in the story about the rockets. The rockets that the Titanic was sending up, and also what I think is Captain Lord of the Californian.
Yeah.
Just explain that bit, because folks.
Yeah. Okay. It's a little bit confusing, but yeah, I can't really definitively explain it. I mean, I've got an idea what might have happened, but it is only my speculation. And that is that I believe that Captain Lord, was told a different story about what colour rockets to expect to put him off the scent and to create the opportunity to get rid of the Federal Reserve conspirators. So, but Lord was expecting white rockets, and Titanic sent red, white, and blue rockets up, and so he ignored them for some very, very strange reason. He saw them, or the crew saw them, and reported back to him, and he said, no, 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 and he kept asking them over and over again, what colour are they? What colour are they? And they kept coming out saying, they're white, they're white. So he just ignored them, and it turned out that between the position of Californian and Titanic, there'd been another smaller ship or boat called the Samson. Now, this didn't come to light until the following year, but what the Samson was, it was an illegal seal hunting boat. So it had sent out all its small boats with these barbarians on them that were clubbing to death seal pups on the ice floes that were plentiful. And the rockets were to recall the boats back to the ship. Now, the captain of the Samson, which was, I think it was a Norwegian ship, off the top of my head, he didn't come forward until the following year because he was scared he was going to get prosecuted for these illegal activities. So it turns out that the white rockets that Lord saw were from the Samson. Yeah.
Yeah, John, I've got a question here for you. I see someone's asked the question. If the officers of the Titanic were in on it, why did the captain go down with the ship?
Well, this is a very, very interesting one, actually. There is a lot of evidence to say that the captain did not actually go down with the ship at all. And this is all covered in my book. There is a body of evidence, shall we say, that says that Smith survived and hid himself away, and he lived on in America for some years.
Yeah, but because
quite a bit of evidence to support that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that. But the other thing is, the other senior officers, only one of them survived. Only Lightoller survived, isn't that right? The others,
no, three survived, and three or four died. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, but the
Lightoller was the most senior one.
Yeah, because I found, because in the book, John, you go through, because after, obviously this was a huge tragedy and it made global headlines like some other big, more recent major events, 9/11, etc. And so there was two. I mean, there was two inquiries, the US one and then the one back in England, and Lightoller's evidence. He said, obviously, a dodgy witness is how I would have described him.
Yeah. Well, I include, as you know, David, I include a lot of the transcripts from the inquiries within the book itself, and they're just absolute. I mean, it's just a farce. I mean, it's laughable. If it wasn't so tragic, it would be absolutely laughable. As to the stuff that was said, by Lightoller, and especially by the lookouts in the crow's nest. And then, of course, there was the testimony of a guy who absconded before the inquiry, which was a guy called Lewis Klein. And we know he exists, even though he doesn't appear in any crew lists at all. We know he exists because he actually gave what's the word? A deposition to the American inquiry, and it was signed and all official and everything. And they knew that this guy existed because he was one of the eyewitnesses, but he just absconded before the inquiry, and they never saw him again. But he actually gave this very intricate account of the fact that all the crew were drunk because there'd been a party that evening, a farewell party, because it was going to be Captain Smith's final voyage anyway. And the passengers clubbed together through this lavish champagne party. All the drinks that were left over afterwards went to the crew. Most of the on-duty crew were drunk, and this was Lewis Klein's testimony. And he said that when he saw the iceberg in the distance, and he tried to warn them on the bridge and in the crow's nest, the lookouts. He went to the bridge, and the only person on the bridge, apart from the helmsman, which is in the wheelhouse, not the bridge, but the only person on the bridge was one of the senior officers called William Murdoch, who was lying drunk on a bench. So he ran to the crow's nest, the spar with the crow's nest on it, and he climbed up the ladder, and both lookouts were asleep, he said. Now, whether they were drunk as well, we don't know. But he said that they were asleep, and you know, he was believed. But of course, the people who ran the inquiry, American politicians, Senator Smith and Senator Aldridge, I think it was. Again, I don't have any notes with me, so I'm just speaking from memory. Just totally ignored this testimony. Absolutely, it was obvious that it was a whitewash from start to finish, as was the British inquiry. So yeah, I mean, we're not even scratching the surface here, David. Are we? As you know, having read the book, there is so much information and so much evidence for what I'm saying here that and it's all within the pages of the book. That it's just incredible.
I think the thing is, John, if we look back over the last 120 years, there have been these big seminal events, and I would argue that the sinking of the Titanic was one of them. There was other big moments like JFK's assassination, 9/11. I mean, there's been these moments.
Lusitania was another one, another false flag.
Yep, and I think, John, I'll have to have you come back to talk about that one because yes, I know. So I haven't got around to reading all your other stuff, but believe you me, I will do. I'd love you to come back. Yeah. But the thing is, and this is the point I think people need to understand. If people, we've lived through the last couple of years and from the whole COVID scamdemic, and we know that we've been lied to, John. Relentlessly, persistently. We know the authorities are not to be trusted. So my simple point is, why did you think they were to be trusted back in 1912? What do you think they were all good and honest then, and suddenly they became corrupted?
Absolutely not. No, it's always been the same. I mean, the difference is at that time was that people's attitudes were very different. People were much more, shall we say, naive, subservient. They believed what they were told by authority. They were also, as well as I'm actually believing it, they also knew their place. They were easily coerced into doing their master's bidding, shall we say, because the threat of losing the job, there was no social security or dole in those days. If they were without a job for a long period of time, they starved unless the family supported them. But these people were also operating under the threat of loss of livelihood. Don't forget, not just at Harland and Wolff and White Star, but anywhere, because the collusion was going on. Right, it permeated the whole of society. The collusion, at the upper echelons. So yeah, people were scared to death. I mean, I told you off air about I put an ad in the Belfast Evening Telegraph, and I actually met 3 members of the families of Harland and Wolff shipyard workers, who all told me independently exactly the same story, that their relatives had been threatened with loss of livelihood, not just them, their whole families, which could have been a death sentence in those days. So people were very much under the thumb. And the other thing was, of course, there was no media other than newspapers. And that is a very shall we say, asynchronous kind of media. It's not like today when you've got the internet, you've got social media, you've got mobile phones and all the rest of it. They just had to read newspapers and believe what was said in the newspapers. And of course, the newspapers, just as they are today, were totally controlled by the people who sit up here above government. And of course, they're not going to tell us the truth, are they? They're going to protect their own kind, which is exactly what went on and why people were ignorant of what was really going on.
I think that is exactly the point. The more things change, the more they stay the same. And when you go back to the events of that fateful night in April, back in 1912, I just see it the same as basically what's been happening ever since, and probably what was happening before. Nowadays, we would have social media. It would be harder to cover things up. back then, and you mentioned, as you said, John, in fact, you've been to Belfast, you've spoken to the, I guess, the grandkids of the guys who would have been working
great
there.
grandkids in some case,
And I fully get the point you're making, that, you know, those people, they would never have eaten. Their families would have starved if they'd have said a word. So, you know, it was different times, and therefore things could not be gotten out. So essentially the switch, which I do believe happened, and as you detail it, John, so admirably in your book, I think that switch did happen. And, you know, there are lovely aspects, detailed bits like the carpeting, which I think which you highlight, the fact that why was it carpeted? And you've perfect, you know, why would they do that? Well, you suggest, why they would do that, you know, on the insurance, John, one on the insurance, because that bit fascinates me as well, the insurance claim. So the Titanic sunk. It was insured, wasn't it? But am I right in thinking the insurance was increased before the ship went down?
Titanic costs, I think, again, you have to forgive me if I'm misquoting these figures, but these are approximate. And I'm just doing it from memory, and it's a long time since I've read my own book. So, okay, I think Titanic cost £2.3 million to build in 1912 money. And White Star's policy was to insure them for 75% of the value, so that would be about 1.8 million. But in actual fact, a week or a couple of weeks before the sailing, the insurance was up to 3.2 million. Now, what does this remind everyone of? A certain event, whose anniversary has just gone by, and a certain Mr. Silverstein and two very tall buildings in New York. It's exactly the same modus operandi. It works. Why change a winning formula? So, and the interesting thing about the insurance was, sorry, David, the interesting thing about the insurance was that it was paid out within a week without any investigation at all. Now, if we were to spill red wine on our carpet and claim a bill for 500 quid or something, you know, you'd have to go through the mill, you'd be interrogated, they'd take about 2 months, and eventually they might begrudgingly send you a check. But this 3.2 million, which was way in excess of what Titanic had cost anyway, or 2.8 million, I'm fuzzy on the figures, it was paid almost immediately, exactly like Larry Silverstein's claim for the two Twin Towers, which was also...
I actually spoke to someone associated with Lloyd's on this point, because I was fascinated, because, as you said, my experience of insurance companies generally is, as you said, you spill a glass of red wine, good luck with getting them to pay out. So that's my experience. But I was speaking to someone associated with Lloyd's, and they were saying, well, no, Lloyd's will pay out and then they will investigate. Now, I'm not sure about that. I don't think that's how it works. And
it's a bit too late, isn't it, to do an investigation after they've paid out? What they're going to do? Demand the money back? I mean, you can't do that, can you? I'm sorry, I've spent it. Cheers, thanks. So, you know.
No, I agree. So the insurance, one bit, as I said, John, there's so many layers to this, and we would be going for hours to cover every angle. But the other thing that needs, so the ship that went down was essentially the rebadged Olympic, which meant that the Titanic, which was now the Olympic, sailed for many more years.
What they did, actually, they rescinded the wreck declaration. They decided that they'd repaired it successfully and it was now seaworthy again. And of course, once they put it out to sea, because it was Titanic, not Olympic, it was perfectly fine. So it went through the sea trials again, and it went through the Board of Trade inspection, which all passenger ships had to do in those days, and it passed, and it plied its trade across the Atlantic for the next 25 years. Now, my contention is that a ship so badly damaged, I mean, the North Atlantic is vicious, even in summer. Now, traveling back and forth across the Atlantic 4, 5, 6 times a month, which is what it did for 25 years, there's no way that such a badly damaged ship could have coped with that. Absolutely none whatsoever.
No, that's a really good point. Yeah, and then there's another brilliant, as I say, I do recommend everybody make sure you buy John's book. We'll put a link up. Here you go. That's the Kindle edition, but this is the paperback edition. You can get. And John, there's a lovely little kind of epitaph story concerning. I think is it a portion of the staircase from the alleged Olympic.
Oh yeah.
But that ended up in a pub or a hotel somewhere in South
England.
It's
in a place called Alnwick in Northumberland. I've been to the hotel and I've seen all the woodwork from the Olympic when it was scrapped in 1937, but it was the Titanic really. It has been used as interior furnishings in a hotel, and the name of the hotel in Alnwick escapes me at the minute, but if anybody wants to Google it, the town is spelled Alnwick, pronounced Alnwick, so you don't pronounce the L in effect. And if you Google that and say Olympic Alnwick, it'll come up with the name of the hotel if anybody's ever interested in visiting. It is fascinating, because you're actually standing in history. It's, I found it quite moving actually.
Because you're standing in this part of the staircase of the Titanic.
Yeah. Yes, actually, it is the Titanic. Yeah, not the Olympic, but of course, all the accolades all say it's the Olympic, but it's not. They don't know it, of course, but it is. It's actually the Titanic. Yeah.
And the evidence that suggests that what you've just said is correct. It's to do with the number, isn't it? The number, is it 401? That.
Oh yeah. Well, no, what it is, a lot of people who oppose this story, in other words, the shills that try and debunk this as a conspiracy theory, actually use there is a famous photo of one of Titanic's propeller on the ocean floor which is number stamped 401. So they say, well, that 401 that is actually Titanic's build number. Olympics was 400, which it was. But what they don't take into account was that, remember we talked right at the beginning about the sunken wreck that the Olympic ran over, one of its first accidents, and it lost a propeller. Well, when it went back to Belfast, there wasn't a spare, so they borrowed one off the still under construction Titanic, so it had the build number 401 on it, even though it was the Olympic. So that's a debunk, if you like.
Yeah. I mean, there was obviously then, like, all this happened back then, and then in 1988 or whenever, Robert Ballard, he then found it.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, it's just a myth. I mean, we know that they knew where it was all along. I mean, there's a photograph of a newspaper report from 1953 where it says Titanic wreck found. And they found the wreck. They couldn't get down to it because they didn't have the technology, but they knew exactly where it was. And they used sonar, which was in its infancy then, to actually make a map and create the image of the wreck. So we know that this 1985 story is just nonsense. It was Robert Ballard. Again, Robert Ballard is a CIA operative. He ostensibly works for Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute on the east coast of the States, but he's a CIA operative. And he actually admitted it. I've got a quote from Ballard in the book. He said, we were actually hunting for a sunken nuclear sub, a sunken US nuclear sub. We didn't want to give the game away because the Russians would have put a satellite on us, was his words. So we thought, that would be a jolly wheeze. Pretend we're going to find the wreck of the Titanic. So that's exactly what they did. And it was just a ruse to convince the Russians that they weren't actually looking for these sunken nuclear sub.
I think the story of the Titanic, John, it is one of the most apocryphal stories that there's been. And I mean, I remember being in Las Vegas back in about 2014, and they had an exhibition on in one of the hotels in Vegas of the Titanic exhibition, and I went round it, and they claimed to have one of the largest sections of wreckage that had been taken up. I remember looking at that, and I just think that the Titanic story captures people's imaginations, but we have to confront truth. We just can't live in imagination. And just because, I mean, in 2022, I think when it comes to like Hollywood movies, nobody believes what those Hollywood movies are saying. But that's essentially what happened in the 1954, John, or whenever A Night to Remember came out. So there's a myth being deeply implanted in people's mind. I see somebody is saying, agreeing with you, John. One of our friends here says but Ballard, he says he was retrieving Soviet nukes. So
they were actually American nukes, but I mean that's
nukes, whatever, But and the other thing is, isn't it curious that all the stuff they've sent down to the ocean floor have they ever found anything apart from the propeller number that says, that is definitely the Titanic and not the Olympic? Have they?
There are some images. I'm not sure whether they are fake or not, but there are some images that purport to show the M and the P, because the nameplate of the Titanic has fallen off, and you can just about, in the mists of the sea water, see M and a P. But I'm not sure. I wouldn't want to say that is absolutely gospel, because I'm not sure about it. I've not seen any corroborating evidence for that. But apparently there are images floating around on the internet that say that. I mean, the other big thing is the fact that we know that Olympic's undercoat was grey and Titanic's was black. Right now, clearly on the wreck below, you can see where the outer coat has fallen off and the undercoat is grey. You can see portions of the undercoat on the actual ship, so we know. I mean, okay, it's not beyond total reasonable doubt. I mean, there's always reasonable doubt with everything, but I would say it's 99+% certain that is actually Olympic on the ocean floor in the Titanic.
Yeah. Well, listen, John, we've come to our allocated time. I know you've done, I think, marathon presentations going on for hours and hours. And I have to say to everybody, listen, I've read this book from cover to cover. It's such a good read, John, because you go right back to arguably, I think, 1873 or whatever it is, and then takes the story right up to 1903, 1912, and indeed subsequent cover-up inquiries and all. And it's really good. John, you've got a lot of other interesting books, and I hope if you've enjoyed this, perhaps you might come back at another time and we can maybe chat about some of your other work. I found that book in the Titanic. It's comprehensive. It's a masterful detailing of the events, and as you said, you can't be certain of everything. I mean, that's just the way life is. But you can be certain enough to have very big questions over established narratives, which everybody should have in 2022. And so,
I always say, sorry, David, to interrupt. I always say that circumstantial evidence is accepted in court. So why would circumstantial evidence not be accepted in this case? There are a lot of modicums of proof, but there's also a hell of a lot more circumstantial evidence, a lot of which we've just covered. But we have really only just scratched the surface.
I know. As I said, John, when I was reading the book, I was very sad to get to the end of it, because it was so good. I mean, because if you think you know the story of the Titanic, you don't. But if you read John's book, you've got a damn good idea as to more or less what was going on. And as I say, in these times, John, and I know the content of some of your other books, and that's why I'm really keen to chat to you in the future, that it is just important that we do look under the hood. We actually shine a light into some of these establishment myths, which can be very convincing, and we talk about CIA guy who originally wrote the book, as you do when you're a prototype CIA guy back in the 50s, you know, all these things. It's just, so yes, Trevor, I'm glad you're going to get the book. I suggest everybody who's watching this or listening to this when we put it out as a podcast, honestly, enrich your life. Go and buy John's book. And John, I want to thank you so much for coming on and giving us your time. It's been fantastic.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank everyone, all the comments, you know, all the kind comments that, I mean, thank you everyone for listening. I hope it's, you know, enlightened you. I'm sure some of you already kind of knew the story anyway a little bit, but you know, it's been an absolute pleasure, David. I'm delighted, and I'd be more than happy to come back anytime you want me.
So what I need to now do is go to the Titanic Museum in Belfast and have a word.
See if you can get them to sell copies of my book there. Yeah, that'd be interesting.
That would be quite a challenge. I mean, I've been in it. It's very well done. It's very well done. It's just they got the wrong ship. But apart from that, and they completely missed the plot. Apart from that, it's really well done. But John, listen, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you, folks, for watching, for listening. Thanks for being here with us this evening, and we'll catch up with you guys real soon. That's it for myself and John, everyone. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.